Hi, everyone. It's your co host, Stu, and I'm here with author, paranormal investigator, and the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you
Hi,
today?
Red. I'm doing fine, honey. How are you doing?
I'm I'm doing just so. You think we'd have that cadence down by now, but not quite. I always put those little pauses in there just for effect. Kind of like a certain 1960s Star Trek actor.
Yes, I know exactly who you might be referring to. But so today we're going to talk a little bit about visions, people that have had these feelings that they have to go with, like intuitions, um, and things that were presentiments of things to happen. So knowing something's wrong or feeling like something's wrong and going with your gut. I'm a big proponent of going with your gut. So we're going to talk about a couple different things today, but they are all interrelated because I think we have to recognize that we don't listen to our instincts very well. We've been taught and trained since childhood to not use our instincts. And I'm not saying just go with every feeling you have, but there are these things that happen that are just overwhelming, or visions that occur to people, and some of them are things that you really, when you read them, you go, oh my gosh, if that cannot be an accident. So years ago, my mother and I had lunch on a cold snowy day, and give you my very first one here.
Okay.
And she was sick. Well, we sat down to lunch and she said she wasn't feeling well, so she said she would rather go home. She thought she was coming down with the flu. The long and the short of it is, I couldn't convince her to stay or to come to my house, which was very close by. She decided she wanted to drive the 28 miles to her home. So she did, and I told her, I said, call me when you get in, just so I know you're there and safe. She did not. And I became overwhelmingly concerned, not logically concerned. My mother was a bit of a free spirit. So she would like head for home and then end up at her best friend's house or something, right? And so I knew that about her. I had a lifetime with her, you know. But for some reason on this day, I was panicked. And I mean panicked, like shaking, panicked. I can't, calling the cops and finding out if there was anybody admitted to the hospital, panicked. And I had called all her friends, I had called her family, I had called everybody I could think of. Nobody knew where she was. Police said there was nobody of her age and description that had been in the admitted to the hospital or in a car accident. Didn't know what was going on. It was I had to go do a speaking event that night, so around 3 o'clock, I ended up having to get back to the house. I had driven all the roads to her home, every route she might have taken, turned around, came home, got ready for this event, knowing that the place had sold out for the event, and I didn't want to just stiff them. That's not how I work. So I started to get a shower, and all of a sudden I heard her voice loud and clear and audible. She's the only person in the entire world who ever calls me Pat. And I'm in the shower, and all of a sudden I hear very loud, Pat, help me. And I froze for a second, jumped out of the shower, grabbed a towel, screamed for my kids, and said, hurry, hurry, there's something wrong. Peggy's in trouble. I know it. I heard her. And they all get stumbling to the car. I'm pulling on my stuff, as quickly as humanly possible. I didn't worry about brushing my hair, doing anything, just shoes, socks, let's go. And we went and rode all the roads one more time. I could not find her. A dear friend of mine who was going to be at the event that night called me to see what time I was going to the event, and I told him everything that was going on. And he's like, don't worry, my girlfriend and I will find her. Just go do what you need to do. So I do. And I am so panicked by now that I'm struggling to stay focused in any fashion on anything. So I get up, I start the first segment of the event, and I just had a really strong feeling I needed to stop. So I called like a timeout. I said, hey, everybody, I'm going to give you guys a little break. Why don't you guys get to meet and mingle with the guys from my team and use the restroom and stuff? And I no sooner got the words out of my mouth until the phone rang. and it was a nurse in Pittsburgh, and she said, "Are you Patty Wilson?" And I said, "Yes." She said, was your mother so and so?" And I said, "Yes." And then I started to cry, and I said, "Is she alive?" And she said, "Oh, honey, just barely. She was in a terrible car accident.
Oh.
And I think, I'm not supposed to say this, but I think you need to hurry." At just that moment, my oldest son walked in with his little son, and I screamed, "Dan, give the baby to your brothers. We've got to go. Peggy's in trouble." And he just accepted it from the tone of my voice, and he just literally handed the baby over. The other boys grabbed the baby, and a friend of mine who was there said, "I'll take care of everything else. Don't worry. You got the opening done. Now the rest of it's a ghost hunt. We can all ghost hunt with them. We'll explain it." And it ended up, she had had a stroke while driving and had a horrible car accident. And due to the fact that with the stroke, she couldn't control herself, she went the wrong way. I looked in the wrong place. I looked on her way home. Every place she should have turned right, she turned left. Every place she should have turned left, she turned right, and got herself in a totally different area. And so that was like, that horrible feeling just would not let up all day long. And I heard her, right hand to God, I heard her scream my name at approximately the time the car accident hit. We know when it happened because she was rammed by a large truck at an intersection. There were cameras. So it was almost the same moment, give or take a couple seconds.
I'm so sorry to hear that, Sahar. You had to go through that.
It's, it is part of what is, but I have always been a very big believer in going with your gut. And that day I was struggling because I really wanted to go with my gut, but my gut wasn't telling me the right thing. Well, it's telling me there was something wrong, but not the right thing. And that's because I think at that point, my mom and I were beginning to lose the connection, because she was in the middle of the stroke. So she wasn't able to like talk to me the way she always did. Like I had said to you prior to the show starting, my mother would, I'd pick up the phone to call her, and this happened all the time, at least a couple times a week. And she would be already on the phone, and I'd hear her as I'm dialing. She'd be yelling, "Pat, stop, I'm already on the phone," or vice versa. It was that tight of a connection. So I believe that sometimes we see things, we feel things, we hear things. We know things, we just don't know how we know. And that's what this is all about today.
I trust you have more along the same vein then.
I have actually got a couple really interesting stories. This is one that I came across a long time ago, and I have never stopped being amazed by this story. So this story actually happened to George Washington, our president. And at the time, it was the winter he spent at Valley Forge, which was a horrible, defeated winter for the men. Not only did they have no supplies, the men were hungry. They were dying more from the cold and illness than from fighting. And Washington was struggling emotionally. He had been losing right and left. And he didn't know how much longer he could hold out. Now, there have been arguments about whether or not he was as much of a praying man as he's been portrayed to be. But those who wrote about him, who knew him, they would all say the same thing, that he was a man prone to seeking God, to seeking God's face when he was scared or concerned and didn't know what to do. So he's in Valley Forge. It's the winter of 1777, and he's in this cabin. His aides are out in another room, and he's in the back room of the cabin, and he is inconsolable. He's seeking God's face. He's fasting. They were given orders to not disturb him. So eventually he came out of the room late in the evening, and this is what he told his men. And this was actually written about and shared by one of those men. He had written about it in his journal at the time, and as an older man, he was interviewed about his time with Washington. And among the stories he related would be this story. So, as I said, Washington was struggling with anxiety, with fear, with thinking that this was over, that he had led these men to their death for nothing. And you can only imagine what kind of guilt and pain that was bringing to this man who believed in this cause. And he would look up, and there ahead of him was a woman. He said she was of singularly beautiful nature, and he couldn't figure out how she got in the room. And then he asked her, what brought her here? She said nothing. And then he asked her a second, a third, and a fourth time, but still she said nothing. And he said by this time he had a very strange sensation. I'll give you his own words. By this time I felt strange sensations throughout me. I would have risen, but the riveted gaze of this being before me rendered volition impossible. I essayed once more to speak, but my tongue had become useless, as if paralyzed. A new influence, mysterious, potent, and irresistible, took possession of me. All I could do was gaze steadfastly, vacantly, at my unknown visitor. Eventually, the woman who he would come to believe was an angel, and because of what her next actions were, she finally spoke, and she said, "Son of the Republic, look and learn." And she began to tell him, and he said that there was a white vapor that just came rising out of the cabin floor and rose up, and as it dissipated, he could see a scene. It spread out like a vast plain, he said, and she described for him the whole world, and he could see it laid out like a map. And she said, "Son of the Republic." At this moment, he said he saw a shadowy being as an angel. He realized she was there. He saw another angel with a map floating above the earth, above the planet. And she began to talk to him about what his mission was, what this country's mission was. And she talked about the first great peril. Trying to give you just a couple of the words because it's literally 7 pages long, so I'm trying to pick judiciously. Said that clouds rose up from the countries and they joined in the middle of the ocean, and for a while remained stationary, and then they moved slowly westward until they enveloped America in its folds. Sharp flashes of lightning gleamed through the intervals, and I heard the smothered groans and cries of the American people. He believed it was the war for independence. The second peril, the second time the angel had dipped her hand into the water on the map. So she dips her hand in again and sprinkles it out in front of him, and a dark cloud seemed to draw back from the ocean. And then he saw another view, and then a third time this was done. And she says, "Son of the Republic, look and learn." And I cast my eyes upon America and beheld villages and towns and cities springing up, until the whole land from the Atlantic to the Pacific was dotted with them. That's not important to us, but you have to understand the Louisiana Purchase hadn't happened. We never believed it as a country at that point in time. We were going to go beyond the Ohio Valley. So he saw this vision 50 years before any of this began to play out. And he said he looked at her, he looked at what was going on. "Son of the Republic, the end of the century comes. Look and learn." And again, he looked southward. And he said, "From Africa, I saw an ill-omened specter approach our land. It flitted slowly and heavily over every town and city of the latter," meaning our country. "The inhabitants presented themselves as in a battle array against one another." Is that the Civil War? As I continued looking, I saw a bright angel on whose brow rested the word Union. He bore an American flag. He placed the flag between the divided nation and said, "Remember, you are brethren." Instantaneously, the inhabitants cast away their weapons and were friends once more. And then one last peril. "Son of the Republic, look and learn." And the angel placed a trumpet to his mouth and blew 3 distinct blasts. Taking water from the ocean, he sprinkled it on Europe, Asia, Africa. And then my eyes beheld a fearful scene. From each of these continents arose thick black clouds that were soon joined into one, and throughout this mass there gleamed a dark red light, by which I saw hordes of armed men. Men moving with the cloud, marching by land and sailing by sea to America, which country was enveloped in the volume of the cloud. And dimly I saw the armies devastate the whole country, the villages, the towns, the cities. As my ears listened to the thundering of cannons, the clashing of swords, the shouts of millions in mortal combat, the voice said, "Son of the Republic, look and learn." Where the voice had ceased, the shadowy angel placed his trumpet once more to his mouth and blew. Instantly, another scene opened. And then the final part, and he talks about another war. And then the final part comes. Once again, I beheld the villages, the towns springing up where I had seen them, and a bright angel planted an azure standard, which he brought into the midst of them, and cried in a loud voice, "While the stars remain and the heavens send down dew upon the earth, so long shall this union last." And taking from his brown brow the crown emblazoned with the word union, he placed it upon the standard, where all the people knelt down and said, "Amen." This was written in 1780 as related by one of his aides who wrote it down as he spoke it in 1777.
Extraordinary.
So, Son of the Republic, I believe him to have been chosen by God, him to have been unique in so many ways, and for him to have seen the vision for what he had fought for and laid out. And after this, the tides would turn in the war. For those who don't know, he waited until Christmas, and on Christmas night, he sailed across the Delaware to Trenton. He took the first great decisive victory he'd had in a long time. And from there, the victories would continue to mount time after time after time. And he carried within his bosom the words that had been spoken to him in that crude little cabin in 1777. I love this vision. I love it because even if it was fictional, if you wanted to make that argument, there is no way that in 1780, when it was published, they could have known those things to be.
Yeah, true. And the Civil War was 100 years from then.
The Civil War, laying it between the two sections of the country that existed, the Mason-Dixon line, which would have been in existence not so long after. All of that stuff is fantastic. It's just amazing. And when you think about what that might actually mean, he was given a vision of our history before it happened. And I believe he was given a commission at that time. So now I'm going to go forward a little ways to Joshua Chamberlain and Gettysburg during the Civil War.
Okay.
So Chamberlain, who is arguably one of the most popular figures in Gettysburg history, had a great, interesting experience. While he was in Gettysburg, he would write about it in his own journals, and that is how we came across this story. This is my friend Mark Nesbitt's story. He has written about it in his Ghosts of Gettysburg books. I want to make sure that he gets credit for this, but I happen to think this is my favorite story Mark ever tells. I always make him tell it to me when we're doing speaking gigs, and he'll ask me if I want to hear a story. He knows I'm going to pick this one because this is one of my favorite stories of all time. So Chamberlain and his men are marching along. He's on horseback. There are several other officers on horseback. They're headed into Gettysburg from the south to start participating in the battle, which is interesting because the north came from the south and the south came from the north for that battle.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going along this little road, and all of a sudden, in the distance in the back, there was a man riding up on a white horse, a white gray horse. And the man just had a bearing about him like he was important. So the men parted way as the man rode through, and he passed through the soldiers heading forward. They expected him to stop at Chamberlain, and he didn't. He passed by Chamberlain, but Chamberlain saw him, his blue cape flying, his tricorn hat on, the white pinned hair in the back. And the word started to whisper through the men. Did you see that man? Do you know who he is? No, I don't know. He looks a lot like Washington. And he led them, staying ahead of them all the way into the battle that day. And then he simply disappeared.
You got me thinking back to previous episodes of time travel.
Uh-huh.
And this, that's where my mind went with this. Even with Washington too, that somebody from the future created that for him, that he was being, I don't want to use the term groomed, but led on, because back in, oh my goodness, back in my school days, I had to write a paper on George Washington. And the more I dug into it, I found that up until that point that you say, up until Trenton, he was a bungler.
He was such a, yeah. He was such a bungler. He wasn't, people think of him as this great man, and he was very, he was a young guy who stumbled a great deal. He was a British officer who failed at different places, in his life. He would have been better off, frankly, had he not agreed to become the commander of the army. People don't know this, but there was a meeting held at the General Wayne Inn, in which Mad Anthony Wayne participated, where they were going to get rid of Washington. They wanted to replace him with somebody else. And it was Wayne's impassioned defense of this man that made them hold the line. There's an amazing story. He and Wayne had a couple really amazing events happen. Wayne rode through an icy storm one night to save Washington's life. There was this they weren't necessarily best friends, and they didn't actually work together a great deal, but there was this kinship, if you will. But Anthony Wayne is the one who spoke up, otherwise he would have been removed prior to that winter at Valley Forge. So as a history buff, as you well know, and the French and Indian in the colonial period are my favorites. When I read this the first time, which would have been 25 years ago, I remember sitting there reading it, and I wept. I read this first part. I knew that one. I actually found that in a book that was written in 1780. An old library shut down, and I bought a bunch of old history books, did not realize that this was a George Lepard book and that it was an original edition. George Lepard knew Washington.
Oh, nice.
And I paid $2. And thought myself lucky then.
You still have it?
Indeed. Indeed. And he talked about Washington. There's some amazing stories in that book and other stories, but I'll spare you for that for a history lesson some other day. So I thought that this was a phenomenal set of stories to start us off.
Oh yeah, what's going to top that, or what's going to top those?
Well, we're going to go bumping along a few other things, and then I think that I'm going to be able to bring it home at the end, because I've really worked on this episode. People don't know that I don't just know it all in my head. Some of it I do know. Some of it I have bits and pieces floating around in my head, but I probably take about 15 to 20 hours per episode of research, pulling it all together. If I had to, I can give you every documentation note. I have 75 pages of notes for this episode.
We don't have that much of a description in either the video
or
platforms.
But if somebody would email or text me or text us and say, hey, how did you know that? And where did you get that? Got it. I can answer them very quickly. Complete
bibliography. Yeah.
No. I had to learn how to do this for the book. So everything I write, I have a biblia for. So the next one will be Abraham Lincoln. This is one that people may have heard a little bit about. Lincoln was very troubled about becoming president the second time, and he had two events. The first one is not as well known, but the second one was well publicized, at least for many years. So the first thing, he's back in Illinois. He's at his home with his wife. And, I have to say that this family had had so much loss. A lot of people make great fun of Mary Todd Lincoln, but I want you to know this woman lost 2 children and her husband in a couple years. So if she had a nervous breakdown, God bless.
Mm-hmm.
So they've already buried their sons, 2 little boys. And they go home and they're tired. They're almost defeated. The war is almost over. And Lincoln is not well thought of in great many realms, even in the North. He was despised. In fact, Bedford County paper, if you read the article about Bedford County paper when he gave the Gettysburg Address, they call it things like insipid and vapid, and and they castigate him roundly for it. Anyhow, so they're home, and he's deciding whether or not he's going to go for a second term, and Mary was encouraging him to finish this out, to see it through. And he gets up to shave in the morning, and he sees 2 images of himself. One is the one that looks just like him, and the other is gray and pale. And it fades away as he's watching in the mirror. And he is really shaken by this. It brings him this profound sense of despair. And he tells Mary about it, and she starts to cry. She says, "I think you're going to die before you're done being president this time." And even with that, they talk it out, and they realize that he can't run away from his destiny. He needs to finish this out through. So that he goes and he runs and he wins and he becomes president. Only about 2 weeks before his assassination, he would get up and was very disconcerted by what he had dreamt. And he would tell his family and his friends, including a letter he wrote to his business partner, which is where we get the account, because the business partner saved a letter, and which would become poignant and prophetic only 2 weeks later. So what he wrote to his friend was that he was in the East Room at the White House, and there was a casket laid in there to rest. There were 2 young soldiers, one at the foot and one at the head, and he said, in his own words, "About 10 days ago, I retired very late. I had been up waiting for important dispatches from the front. I could not have been long to bed when I fell into slumber, for I was weary, and I soon dreamed in a death-like stillness about me. Then I heard the sobs, subdued in the distance." And he walked into the room, in the East Room in the White House, and he said he got out of bed. He thought he was awake. He said, "I got out of bed and I wandered downstairs, and I could hear the pitiful sobbing of the mourners. I went into the room, and there was no living person in sight, but the sobbing sounds continued to distress me as I passed along. I saw a light in all the rooms, every object familiar to me. But where were all of the people who were grieving as if their hearts would break? I was puzzled and alarmed. What could be the meaning of all of this? Determined to find the cause of a state of things so mysterious and shocking, I kept on until I arrived at the East Room. Then I entered, and I found a sickening surprise. Before me was a catafalque, on which laid a wrapped corpse in funeral vestments. Around about were stationed soldiers who were acting as guards, and there was a throng of people gazing mournfully upon the corpse, whose face was covered. Others wept pitifully. "Who is dead in the White House?" I demanded of one of the soldiers. "The president," was his answer. "He was killed by an assassin." Then came a loud burst of grief from the crowd, which woke me from my dream. I could sleep no more that night, and the dream stayed with him. And 2 weeks later, that would come to pass, and his face would be covered because he was shot in the head. It's amazing and poignant, and if you look at it, the letter, and read the entire thing, because I kind of cut through it a little bit. Not nearly as long as Washington's vision, but definitely interesting. There were a lot of things that had to happen wrong for that night to have happened the way it did. It's almost as though it was set up, and he was being warned to be ready. So a couple little quick ones. Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, the author,
Okay.
had he had a precognitive dream in which he saw his brother's casket. He dreamt of it. He scared him. He woke up. He contacted his mother. He said, "Is my brother okay?" His brother worked on board a steamship. And she said, "Yes, I just heard from him." About a week later, the steamship would blow up. His brother would be dead. It would happen in the middle of the night, and he would know it happened before his mother contacted him to tell him, because his brother appeared at the foot of his bed to say goodbye.
Then just imagine what that would do to you. I mean, if you saw something like that. That was.
Yeah. So I found it fascinating. I've known that story a long, long time. There have been all kinds of, every time there's a disaster of any sort, there's people that come out and say, I didn't go on that plane. I didn't travel to that place. I didn't do whatever because I just had a terrible feeling. There's a place called Aberfan, and it's in South Wales. And nearly 150 adults and children were killed in the 1966 when a waste from the mine that was in the town buried the school in South Wales. So psychiatrist John Barker visited the town and spoke to the residents, hoping to help them to deal with their grief. But what he found was that many of them had had profound experiences of premonitions about the disaster. Some of the children who had died had mentioned dreams and premonitions of dying the days before it happened. Parents came to him grief-stricken, saying, "I should have listened," things like that. He found that he was able to verify 60 different accounts where people said prior to the accident, so-and-so is really upset, they don't want to go to school, so-and-so's been having nightmares about such and such, that these were verifiable accounts. So, and you heard about the World Trade Center, you've heard it about just about every disaster that's ever happened, people that just have a ticket to get on a plane, a train, or a boat and turn around and walk away. And when they realize it's destroyed later, they'll say, I would never have done it, but that day I just knew I couldn't get on. It wasn't a good idea.
That reminds me a little bit of a story my mother told me. So this had been after I, moved out of the house and moved on. But she was saying she worked at the Nittany Lion Inn for Penn State. And she worked the evening shift, and she was coming home. Well, coming off the expressway, it's a rather big intersection. So you're coming off the exit, and you got to go over 6 lanes, or you got to go over 3 lanes. I mean, it's a pretty large intersection. Okay, so the lights are timed to make sure that everybody can get through. Well, she's behind one other car, and the light turns green. The car in front of her immediately starts going and turning left. And my mother said there was something that told me not to go. And so she didn't. And so going through the red light, a tractor trailer came down and just T-boned the car that was in front of her, which contained the older brother of one of my friends. And he was decapitated in the accident.
My goodness.
So, and my mother, who's a deeply spiritual woman, is convinced that God told her not to pull out into that intersection at that particular time. So
I have no doubt that that's true then.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's really amazing. There are so many stories of dreams and things like that have happened. In this area, there's a story of the Lost Cox children. I'm not sure if you're familiar or not, but
the name's familiar, but I don't recall the story. No.
It's you'll hear it either said as the Lost Cox children and the Lost Children of the Alleghenies, things like that, different monikers, but it basically goes back to the same story. So it was early spring, late 1800s, and the Cox family had several small children. They lived up on the mountain there above Pavia, and on that particular morning, it was kind of cold and rainy and damp, and the kids were at breakfast with their mom and dad in the little cabin, and the 2 little boys, Georgie and Joey, wanted to go with their dad hunting. He was going to go squirrel hunting to get food for for them, and they were collecting the squirrel tails. But it was cold and rainy, so he had said to them, go ask your mother, whenever they came outside to follow him. And he proceeded on to go hunting because, that's how you fed your family, and you didn't dilly-dally about it. You had to get done.
Right.
So he's going through the woods. He comes back. It's late in the like lunchtime-ish, and he says to his wife, "Where are the kids?" And she's like, "Aren't they with you?" And they're 5 and 7 years old. And he's like, "No, I told them to come and ask you. Did you send them with me?" And she's like, "No, I told them to go ask you." Typical kids playing it off on both parents. So what they begin to think is that maybe the boys didn't ask their dad. They just followed along behind at a distance. So now it's cold, it's rainy. There's been a spring melt, so the water's high in the little creeks. He gets up and he's like, oh my gosh. He goes back out. He's looking for him. He realizes he's not finding them. It's getting dark. He goes to a neighbor's house, and they ride into town, and a whole bunch of people start up into the woods to look for these little boys. At the apex, there will be 400 people from as far away as Maryland who end up there. So for about a week and a half, they're looking for these little boys. It's cold and miserable and damp and rainy. It's early spring in Pennsylvania. And they make one decision, is that there's a creek there not too far from where the kids lived, and it was really, really swollen. And they figured the kids wouldn't go near the creek because it was just too high. They could never have crossed it. Now, in Roaring Spring, there was a gentleman by the name of Jacob Dybert. He had heard the stories, but he was ill, so he wasn't able to go help. And at first his wife thought it was guilt. He got up 3 mornings in a row, about a week and a half in, and he said he had the same nightmare and the same dream every night. And it was a dream that he was walking through her brother's farm. Her brother lived up on that mountain, and he's in the woods, and he comes to this creek, and there's a tree down across the creek a little ways up. He walks across the tree. He sees a dead deer laying in the path. He sees a little boy's shoe, and he goes on up, and he sees the 2 little boys laying at a fork in the creek, like leaning up against a tree, and he'd startle awake. So they go. It's the 3rd night convinces him that they have to do this. They have to go. So despite not doing so well, still being ill, they get in the wagon, and they head over to her brother's house. He tells his brother-in-law the story, and his brother-in-law's like, I know exactly where you're talking about. So he takes off down the path. Sure enough, he walks up a ways from where he had been looking, and there's a tree that has fallen across the water. He walks across the tree. There's a dead deer laying there at the edge of the path. Further down, he finds a little boy's shoe. He keeps going, and he finds the 2 little boys. The oldest one was holding his little brother's head in his lap when they've succumbed to the weather and cold, and they died there. But Jacob Dybert had that dream. Now, I have to tell you, there were people that accused him of killing the boys, all kinds of stuff, but it was proven by neighbors and doctors and what have you that he was sick. He was at the house, and they were attending him. And then he became very popular. There was a spring picnic every year for a long time, and they would go up to that place and have a memorial picnic, and he would tell the story of how the boys led him. And it's believed that the night that the little boys died was the night that the dreams began, as if they were trying to find a way to get themselves home.
That's so sad.
It is a sad story. I have to tell you, the first time I wrote that story, my kids were 5 and 7, my boys.
Oh my.
I would write for half an hour and bawl for an hour, write for half an hour and bawl for an hour. It's a tragic story, and it was, that one miscalculation, not crossing, going up the road a little bit or the woods a little bit, not looking, not realizing a tree had fallen across, and the boys just walked across it. And by the way, at Fort Bedford, they have the table from the family's cabin.
I've never been to Fort Bedford. Yeah.
Well, we have to remedy that this summer.
Been to Fort Robideau, but not Fort Bedford.
So we'll definitely have to remedy that then, because really beautiful place. I like it a lot.
I'll put it on my short list. I know that Mrs. Stu will be happy to make a day trip of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a nice little drive for you. It's only about 35 minutes, something like
Yeah.
that. So it's not too long. And so I wanted to talk about the Titanic. Stories about people who were on the Titanic and people who had family members that were going to go on the Titanic. We're going to get to in a little bit, because the Titanic seems to be one of those things that long before it ever occurred, um, it was being warned about, if you will. So there were people, if people don't know, there are two books. Everybody's heard about the one. It's called what is it, the Sinking of the Titan, but it's not its first name. Okay, it was actually printed 14 years earlier under a different name, but the book was about a ship called the Titan that was this great cruiser that was not unsinkable, that had about 3,000 people, that hit an iceberg in the middle of the night and it ripped into the side of the ship, and that there were not enough lifeboats and people died needlessly. The band played on and it was filled with mega wealth. I mean, it was the story written 14 years earlier. And people don't realize it came back out as the Titan later, because that was so close to the Titanic that they changed the name and reprinted the book. But it was originally called Futility. And then there's a second story that was written 2 years prior to the Titanic striking the iceberg. And in that book, again, same scenario, giving details, some of the names of some of the staff, some of the mistakes that were made. All of that stuff was in the books. So it was almost like a nonfiction premonition of, I mean, the books both were fiction books, but when you read the details, it was something else. It was amazing. And neither one of the books had any great circulation. I mean, they were uneventful, didn't sell well. There were a few copies floating around kind of books. And, people just had no idea. So, and the second book, by the way, just so everybody knows, is How the Mail Steamer Went Down in the Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor. So it's written from the perspective of a survivor 2 years prior to the actual events. And I have to tell you, it's not a great name, but apparently it was like there were warnings and then warnings upon warnings upon warnings. So there were a lot of people who struggled in the days prior to the Titanic's collapse, because they were convinced something was going on. And it's fascinating to read some of their stories. There was a young woman, she was a little girl at the time, who actually there's a video of her being interviewed as an old woman in her home in Philadelphia. And her name was Eva, and she would tell the story of her mother. So when there was a series of events that happened that caused the Hart family, H-A-R-T, Hart family, to not get on the ship that they were supposed to be on. So they were offered a berth on the Titanic, this amazing, fantastic ship. And normally her mother would have been extremely thrilled for this upgrade. But on that particular day, she was upset. She stomped her foot. She said, absolutely not. I don't want to get on this ship, blah, blah, blah. But her husband, who had a cooler head, prevailed. And they got on ship with the children. So Eva Hart, she's, a little girl. She's in her bed and her berth. Her dad was a very sober kind of gentleman, so he had stayed in the room with her while her mother went out and had dinner and did a little bit of gambling on board the ship. And then she came back and she's sitting down, she's crocheting a little bit. Her husband had fallen asleep reading a book, and she said her mother would always talk about, she felt a bump, not unlike what you might feel in a train, if it would jolt forward. It was that kind of a feeling. And immediately she started waking her husband up. She literally pulled him out of bed. She was like, we have to hurry, we have to hurry, we have to hurry. And he gave her one of his heavy overcoats, and he didn't question her at all. He just started going. And he grabbed his other overcoat. He grabbed up Eva in a pile of blankets, and they ran for the stairs. They got upstairs. There was very few people out on the ship at that point. Everybody was still in the dining halls and, you know, going about their night and what have you. A few people wandering around, and her father got her and her mother into a lifeboat. And even at that point, the staff there had no clue what was going on. Her mother kept saying, we got to hurry before it sinks. And somebody finally said to her, what makes you think it's going to sink? This is an unsinkable ship. And she's like, oh, for God's sakes, put the boat down. We're going to sink. And eventually the decision was made that they would fill the lifeboats, or almost fill them. Actually, the boats were actually half empty, just as a matter of historical records, which is tragic. So, you know, several hundred more people could have survived. But they were going to put the boats down, get them away from the ship a little ways, and then they were going to wait and see what repairs needed done and then bring them back. But because this lady and some others were very panicked, they thought this is probably the best thing. We don't need them panicking the entire ship.
Mm-hmm.
So she was among the first to be put down. And it would only be later that her husband said to her, how did you know? And she said, I didn't know. She didn't know the ship was going to sink when she first felt the bump. She knew that this was the thing she was afraid of. And she started upstairs. Now, where they were at in the ship, they would not have been able to make it to the top had they not gone immediately. They would have got clogged up in the hallways with a bunch of other people and most likely have been casualties. But her mother's presentiment all the way through that this was something bad was going to happen, and they needed to get to the deck, and they needed to get into a lifeboat, and all of this saved all their lives. And you can look it up. You can go on YouTube, look up Eva Hart, and you can actually hear her tell the story as an elderly lady.
Will do.
It's an interesting story to hear. And there are just so many stories that go with it. You know, there are stories about staff who accidentally ended up being on the boat, you know, and they weren't supposed to be on it. There's a gentleman by the name, he was Chief Officer Henry Wild, and he was added to the crew last minute, literally joining them like seconds before they pulled out of Southampton. And he actually wrote a letter to his sister, and he said, I still don't like this ship. He had talked to her before about the ship as it was in the shipyards, saying there was something about the ship that frightened him, and he did not want to be given duty on that ship. So he had specifically requested not to go on that ship. But due to not being able to have a full complement of staff, he was shifted over there at the last minute. And so he wrote a letter, and he said, I still don't like this ship. And then he added, I have a queer feeling about it. And he had written that to his sister, and he had mailed the letter before they set off. And he would not only be a victim, but his actions would actually contribute to what happened. So he didn't do his job accurately or in as timely as he should have, and it actually contributed to the whole thing. And he had a really strong dislike of this ship, so much so that he had gone to his supervisors and said, don't do it, don't put me on there, please. Another victim was a U.S. Army major and an advisor to the president, Archibald Butt. He was a first-class passenger coming back from a vacation. He was so anxious about this ship that before he would go on board the ship, he insisted that he had to have his last will and testament. He said he wrote it and sent a copy of it with his effects to his sister prior to them leaving. He said, if this old ship sinks, my affairs are in order, sister. It was almost like he knew he had to get it done. There were tons of last-minute cancellations, things like that. There were 2 survivors, an Annie Ward, who was a maid, and an Esther Hart, who both had feelings of doom. They expressed it. They begged not to be on the ship. The company put them on board. And there was actually one lady who was on, there were 3 ships originally, who would actually be on all 3 ships when they sunk. The Britannica, the Lusitania, and the Titanic. And she served on all 3 ships. 2 of them, I believe she was a maid, and one of them she was a nurse during World War I. And she survived all 3 times. Just an interesting coincidence.
I wouldn't get on any boat that she was on.
I wouldn't have gotten on a boat after the Titanic. I would have been finding another line of work, man. You know, and there are just so many interesting stories about this. There's a gentleman, his name is Lawrence Beasley, and in a book he had written about the sinking, he was a survivor. And he wrote that he had an out-of-body experience on the ship deck. Here's his exact words. The curious sense of the whole thing being a dream was very prominent, that all were looking on at the scene from a nearby vantage point in a position of perfect safety, and that those who walked the decks or tied one another's lifeboats on belts on were actors in a scene of which I was a spectator, but that the dream would end soon and we would wake up and find the scene had vanished. Many people have had similar experiences in times of danger, but it was very noticeable on the Titanic's deck. I remember observing it particularly while tying on a life belt for a man on the deck. It is fortunate that it should be so. To be able to survey such a scene dispassionately is a wonderful aid in the destruction of the fears that go with it. And he would survive the Titanic, and he would be one of the men who was helping to tie the people into the life belts. So, you know, I thought that was really interesting. But here's one last Titanic story, and then we'll end it there for the Titanic and just kind of finish our evening. I thought this was fascinating. So we know about the 2 books now that were written prior to the Titanic. We know about the people that didn't get on board. We know about the people who got on board and are sorry they did. We know about the people who had visions and what have you. In 1976, nearly 10 years before the Titanic would be found, a gentleman by the name of Clive Cussler wrote a book about the discovery of the ship. It was called Raise the Titanic, and although the massive ship, which was almost 900 feet long and constructed of steel, would presently have been easy to find, this one was not. Cussler actually described what they would find under the water. Remember, there was a big argument up until they found the Titanic that the ship didn't break. Some of the people that were on the lifeboats would testify later that the ship broke in 2. In fact, Eva Hart talked about that in her thing, that she saw it break in 2. And people would call her a liar for many years to come. But he would actually describe it exactly as it happened whenever it was found. He wrote, "Suddenly in the gloom of the outer edge of the blackness, a rounded object became visible, haloed in the eerie light like an immense tombstone. Soon the 3 pairs of eyes inside of the submergible could distinguish the furnished gratings of the great boiler." He talked about a submersible. He talked about it being the type of ship it would be on that would be finding it, which was not the kind of ships they were using for that kind of searching. But for the last minute, they had to switch ships whenever they were actually going out to look for the Titanic. And it ended up being a ship exactly like the one in his book. Oh. He gave all kinds of data and information that 10 years later would turn out to be true. So whatever the ethos wanted to tell us about the Titanic, they started the story before it happened and they ended it before it was found. I just think it's a fascinating story for all those reasons and many more. What did you think of today's episode? Any questions, thoughts?
Oh, I've got, just nothing but positive thoughts. I mean, some of the things I never heard of before, obviously. especially with the Titanic, had no idea of all the different foreshadowings that that were
It was,
associated with that, both pre and post. So did not know about George Washington, Abraham. I did know about Abraham Lincoln, knowing that it had foreshadowed his death. But totally enjoyable stories.
thank you.
Totally enjoyable.
And if by some chance any of our listeners find themselves feeling hesitant about doing something, going somewhere, getting on a plane, a train, or taking a car ride on a certain day, follow your gut. The worst that'll happen is you changed your day and your routine, but much like your mother's story, perhaps you will have avoided something particularly unsavory or something that might even take your life. And I honestly live my own life that way. There have been moments when I've been going down a road, that's the road I like to go, and I'm like, nope, not today. I used to like to, there's a park above the town you live, the area you live in, Holliesburg. And I used to go up there in the mornings and park and just have like a half-hour quiet time, drink my coffee, maybe make a journal entry, and then go on into work because I'm an early bird.
Mm-hmm.
This was years ago. And in Holliesburg, there's a jail. And I was sitting there one beautiful sunny morning, pulled in, just like the hackles went up on the back of my neck. And I'm like, ugh. And I had to use the restroom. And this place has a restroom of sorts. So I thought, I'll just go to the restroom and then I'll leave. And I went to open my car door and I just could not make myself do it. And I got more scared by the second. I finally put the car back on and took off out of there. I've never been up there again like that. I never went there after this. And I found out later that day that there was a gentleman who had escaped from the county jail down there. And then I found out the next morning he had been hiding in the ladies' restroom in that park, hoping that somebody would pull in and he could steal their car. I always go with my gut.
Well, for you, I would say that's probably a safe bet. Yes.
No, I think everybody should. You should listen to what your heart tells you, because sometimes it's a presentiment. It's that warning that this is not it. This shouldn't be there. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't, whatever. Like I said, take another plane, train, or whatever. Go a different route. Decide that this is not the morning to get out and take a little stretch of the legs. We all have those moments in our life. We just have to learn to listen.
Don't eat the gas station sushi.
Amen. I agree. So I wouldn't eat sushi anyway. I don't like the stuff. So do you want to let everybody know how to reach out to us if they have any questions or comments or want to share a story?
How about that? Yes, I can.
All right.
All right. So we do have the YouTube channel, the Paranormalist Podcast. And if you're viewing this on YouTube, and actually all the other places where we publish link back to YouTube. So basically, if you're watching it through Facebook, it links back to YouTube. So if you get to the channel, please, even though you may be subscribed to the Facebook groups, go ahead and subscribe to that channel in YouTube. And when you click the little bell, you'll get notified advancedly, or you'll get notified as soon as we publish new content, which I am sometimes a little bit behind the 8 ball in getting out the work, but so that we have that there. The audio platforms that you can hear, it's 9 different ones, and I don't ask me to list them because there's but all the big ones that you can find the audio on. And then we also have the email address paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com, and we'd be very happy to hear your stories, ideas, feedback, whatever you'd like to share with us. We'd be happy to hear from you.
Absolutely. And please send us everything, because let me tell you, some days I run out of ideas, and I'm always happy to put together an episode based on somebody's asking me that, hey, I'd like to hear stories about this or that, and maybe share your story that got you interested in that subject if you have one.
Great idea.
Thank you, everybody, and I wish you all a wonderful day.
Good night, Patty.
Good night.